In 1974, one of the most famous mysteries in British criminal history took place when an aristocrat called Lord Lucan disappeared after the nanny to his children was murdered and his wife was brutally beaten. The story grips the public imagination because Lord Lucan still hasn't been found all these years later. Neil Berryman is the son of the murdered nanny, Sandra Rivet.
She was very bubbly, easy-going, easy to get on with, you know, just in general, just a lovely, normal person.
Sandra was an outgoing and beautiful 29-year-old. Neil never knew his mum because she gave him up for adoption, but he's found out as much as he can about her since.
I do have an email from Lady Lucan stating that Lord Lucan believed that Sandra was doing a really good job for his children. She worked very hard and she was the best nanny that she'd ever had, and the children loved her to bits.
Lord Lucan is often portrayed as a handsome James Bond-style character. He drove an Aston Martin, raced powerboats, spent time in casinos and came from an old aristocratic family. By the time of the murder, however, he was a professional gambler who was heavily in debt and whose 10-year marriage had fallen apart. He was involved in a bitter custody battle with his wife Veronica over their 3 children, and he'd moved out of the family home to live in a flat nearby. Sandra usually took Thursday evenings off to have a drink with her boyfriend in the local pub. On this particular Thursday, however, she decided to stay home because she was feeling a bit under the weather. She put the 2 younger children, aged 4 and 7, to bed and left the eldest to watch Top of the Pops on TV, which played an eclectic mix of songs that night.
You sheltered me from harm, kept me warm, kept me warm.
Sandra then collected a tray of used mugs from different rooms and went downstairs to make a cup of tea for herself and Lady Lucan.
And went to turn on the light, and the light bulb had been taken out, I believe, from the police records and placed on a cushion. Whoever then murdered my mother thought that it was Lady Lucan that was coming down with the cutlery, and then basically hit my mother over the head several times with a blunt instrument.
After about 10 minutes, Lady Lucan went downstairs to see where Sandra had got to and was herself attacked.
She was hit 3 or 4 times across the forehead, or the front of the head, collapsed and then started fighting with the man. She kicked him in the groin area while he was trying to force his fingers down her throat.
Lady Lucan managed to fight off the attacker and is the only person who can identify him. Detective David Gehring took a police statement the next day.
She told us briefly what had happened, how that she'd been attacked by her husband, Lord Lucan.
I think maybe they both were so exhausted. There must have been a lot of confusion, and Lord Lucan then calmed Lady Lucan down and took her upstairs to clean her up, which is very bizarre.
It is indeed bizarre, if true, that after killing Sandra, who he liked, and trying to kill his wife, he should then change his mind and tend to her wounds. Lady Lucan, meanwhile, chose a moment when he was in the bathroom to run out of the house and call for help at the local pub. When the police arrived, the body of Sandra Rivet was lying in a pool of blood, stuffed in a large mail sack, but Lord Lucan was nowhere to be seen. He'd fled in a borrowed car to the house of an old friend called Susan Maxwell Scott in the village of Uckfield, 40 miles south of London.
One.
Hello, I'm Sigrid Nunez. I met Susan Sontag when I was an editorial assistant at the New York Review of Books, and she ended up becoming probably the most important mentor that I ever had. For a time in the 70s, we shared a household at 340 Riverside Drive. When I decided that I wanted to go away for a bit, I had applied to and gotten into a writer's colony, and the colony was in upstate New York.
2.
It was my first time ever going to a writer's colony, and for some reason I no longer recall, I had to postpone the date on which I was supposed to arrive. I was concerned that arriving late would be frowned on, but Susan insisted this was not a bad thing. It's always good to start off anything by breaking a rule, she said. The only time I worry about being late is for a plane or for the opera. Out to lunch with her one day, realizing I was going to be late getting back to work, I jumped up from the table and she scoffed. "Sit down. You don't have to be there on the dot. Don't be so servile." Servile was one of her favorite words.
3.
Why was I going to a writer's colony anyway? Susan wanted to know. Why would anyone want to leave Manhattan, capital of the 20th century, as she loved to say, for a month in the woods? When I said I could easily imagine moving to the country, maybe not right then, but when I was older, she was appalled. That sounds like retiring. The very word made her ill. She herself was endlessly curious, but not about the natural world. Once I showed her a story I was working on in which a dragonfly appeared. "What's that? Something you made up?" When I started to describe what a dragonfly was, she cut me off. Never mind. It wasn't important. It was boring. Boring, like servile, was one of her favorite words.
4.
Another was exemplary. Also serious. You can tell how serious people are by looking at their books, she said. Not only what books they had on their shelves, but how the books were arranged. Because of her, I arranged my own books by subject and in chronological rather than alphabetical order. I wanted to be serious. It is harder for a woman, she acknowledged, meaning to be serious, to take herself seriously, to get others to take her seriously. But most women were afraid of looking too smart, too ambitious, too confident. They were afraid of looking masculine. Rule number 1 was to get over all that.
5.
Here's one of my favorite Susan Sontag stories. It was sometime in the 60s, after she'd become a Forrest Strauss and Giroux author, and she was invited to a dinner party at the Strausses' Upper East Side townhouse. Back then, it was the custom, chez Strauss, for the guests to separate after dinner, the men repairing to one room, the women to another. For a moment, Susan was puzzled. Then it hit her. Without a word to the hostess, she stalked off to join the men. Dorothea Strauss told the story gleefully years later. And that was that. Susan broke the tradition, and we never split up after dinner again. She was certainly not afraid of looking masculine, and she was impatient with other women for not being more like her, for not being able to leave the women's room and go join the men.